everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. Today, we're diving into a topic that comes up a lot in conversations around separation: narcissism. Now, the word gets thrown around so often these days that it can start to lose its meaning, especially in the emotionally charged context of divorce. But understanding what narcissism really looks like in practice, not just the label, but as a pattern of behaviors, can make an enormous difference in how you navigate the process. So, in this episode, we're going to explore what narcissism actually is, what it isn't, and how to recognize the signs in real life divorce situations. To talk about this, I've invited Sara Woodhouse. Sara is a researcher, a trauma specialist, a coaching psychologist, and an author. She runs a busy private practice combining internal family systems therapy and self led integration to empower people to break free from childhood trauma so they can heal and grow. Sara, it's great to have you today. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for the invite. It's great. It's a great topic. Really
It's a very
interesting.
interesting topic that I've been wanting to address for a while. And it's been an amazing opportunity to meet you and to be able to pick your brain on this. Maybe we start from, the essence of the question, and from a psychological perspective, what exactly is narcissism? How is it defined? And especially how is it, different from just being not a very nice person or a difficult person in the context of a divorce?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's like anything in mental health or any psychological construct, it exists on a spectrum.
Hmm.
So think about anxiety, self-worth,
Yeah.
depression, anything. All
Yeah.
these, they're on a spectrum.
Hmm.
So we all are somewhere on that spectrum when it comes to narcissism. We're talking about
Yeah.
narcissistic traits.
Yeah.
They're human.
Hmm.
There's nothing wildly dysfunctional about being on that spectrum somewhere. But just like with anxiety, say, when you get to the top end of that spectrum, you could potentially then be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
At the top end of that spectrum, of the narcissistic spectrum, you
Yeah.
could potentially be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the cutoff really, and
Yeah.
anything down here is pretty human. We
Hmm.
all move in and out of narcissism, and I think that's a really important point. Is the to distinguish the two? It's really
Hmm.
about how extreme it is.
Yeah.
If someone has NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and what I would say is it's quite rare.
Okay.
That's a really important point. I
So
know.
probably not as common as people think it is when they think it's
No.
their ex necessarily.
Absolutely. So, the prevalence of MPD in the general population is between 1 and 2%, depending on
Oh yeah. Okay.
where you're looking. So it's really quite rare, um, and it's extreme and it's pervasive. That's
Yeah.
that's what we're looking for, really, with NPD. Same with generalized anxiety disorder. It's
Hmm.
generalized. It's not
Yeah.
situational. It's not like, oh, I have to go into work, so I feel anxious today. We're always anxious. And it's the same with
Okay.
NPD. And anytime you're up at that top end of the spectrums, it's
Hmm.
all about it being applied across the board. It's always there,
Hmm.
irrespective of who they're talking to, what the situation is. They
Yeah.
they, they view it. They apply this cluster of kind of traits and behaviors and ways of viewing themselves in the world. So there's NPD, very rare, and then there's narcissistic traits. Now,
Hmm.
arguably, if you're dealing with a partner who is at the higher end of those narcissistic traits, that's also
Yeah.
going to be really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I'm not a psychiatrist. I could have never gone into it. It's not, I don't enjoy the diagnostic process. It's also relatively arbitrary. If you think about where that line is,
Yeah.
we've done a lot of clever maths to figure out where that line is, but it's still arbitrary. So if you're dealing
Yeah.
with someone that has a lot of narcissistic traits, they're quite high on the spectrum, it's still going to be really difficult. Just
Yeah.
they may not be diagnosed with MPD, but they're still going to be really hard to deal with at times.
And would that be because they're triggered by the situation, or again, would you see that fact that they are consistently behaving that way and it applies to all dimensions of their life?
Either, absolutely.
Okay.
But I think the tricky thing with divorce is it is likely to trigger narcissistic traits in a lot of people.
Okay. So it brings
Yeah,
it out in us.
it brings it out.
And we all know that divorce doesn't always bring out the best of people. So I guess that's one
Absolutely.
of the elements.
For sure. So if they're prone to that, if they're prone to a lack of empathy, if they're
Yeah.
prone to controlling behavior,
Yeah.
if they're prone to manipulation, similar to the kind of controlling behavior, if they're prone to kind of grandiosity,
Yeah.
that is going to be triggered because underneath all of those things is this really damaged sense of self, a sense of
Yeah.
inferiority. So
Yeah.
as they feel the rejection of the divorce, they're going to go into those behaviors. So
Okay.
it's really, really, really hard and really common.
And so how do you tell the difference between someone who's just being difficult and for whatever reason, sometimes out of hurt, out of fear, out of whatever is going on in their life, versus someone who's actually exhibiting narcissistic traits?
Well, I think what I would say is it's common to exhibit narcissistic traits. I'm sure I've
Hmm.
done it in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
They are human. It
Hmm.
is human to have a moment of struggling to empathize, or
Yeah.
it, you know, it's human to move into patterns of control. We all do it in
Hmm.
different ways.
Hmm.
That's a
Hmm.
big part of the survival response, of the
Yeah.
trauma response, of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse, is
Yeah.
moving into patterns of control. So it's common. Everybody's moving in and out of these traits, some people more
Hmm.
than others. That's what I would sort of say to that, is
Okay.
that there is a commonness to it. It's
Yeah.
relatively normal. Um,
So it doesn't need to be as vilified as it tends to be.
no,
It's not an illness and it's not necessarily as dramatic as it's also the fact that the context is triggering not always the best part of our personality.
that's exactly right. Yeah. And it's really to do with how extreme it is. And yeah, I would say it's to do with how extreme it is as to how problematic it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And
yeah.
so what are these traits? You've mentioned these narcissistic traits. Could you kind of describe what those would look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean the main ones are so lack of empathy is a big
Hmm.
one.
Hmm.
And that's what we're looking for with any of the diagnostics. There's like
Yeah.
the central, you can't be diagnosed with NPD unless you have, there are secondary traits, but there are some
Yeah.
core ones. So one of
Okay.
the core ones is lack of empathy. So they
Okay.
would almost be unwilling, not just
Hmm.
unable, but unwilling to recognize and identify somebody else's needs and feelings. They
Okay.
just can't do it. And it's interesting because um, there are other kind of diagnoses where people might struggle with that, but in MPD, or when you're at the higher end of those narcissistic traits,
Yeah.
almost feels like an unwillingness to.
Mm.
They're
Okay.
really, yeah, so it's got quite an interesting energy to it.
Yeah.
Um, I think I would also say that I mean, the key one, it's really interesting. There's grandiosity.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
a need to be admired, that can move into a lot of time spent in fantasy. So
Yeah.
fantasizing about, you know, unbridled, unlimited sort of success, power, idealized love,
Yeah.
money, so a lot of time kind of
So
in there.
status in general is important. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And then that's another cool thing as well, is viewing themselves as better than other people.
Yeah.
That's quite simple.
And that's what we often say about narcissists in the law context, the legal context of going to court, that actually they quite enjoy the show in a lot of cases. That moment of being on stage and being able to put on this act of being someone perfect, it gives them a lot of what they're craving.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it tracks absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, it does. Um, so they're the key ones: lack of empathy, grandiosity, and controlling manipulative behavior.
Okay. So
Yeah.
so it's not in that sense, it's not unusual for narcissism to be combined with somebody who's exhibiting coercive control or domestic violence. That there would be a relationship between the two.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I think of anything, that's the key point I want to make, is that
Yeah.
divorce will trigger this.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they're going to get diagnosed with NPD.
Yeah.
Maybe that doesn't matter. If you think
Yeah.
about the arbitrariness of that line, maybe it doesn't matter. That what people need to recognize is that it is inherently triggering.
Yeah.
and therefore, yes, people will are much more likely to move into these patterns of behavior, and they can be conceptualized as narcissistic traits. Absolutely.
But so the interesting next step from that statement is that actually, in all likelihood, both spouses are acting in a slightly narcissistic way during the divorce, and we all tend to revert to those kind of behaviors when we feel under attack and vulnerable. Back to what you're saying about it being just a human trait.
It's really interesting that there are that's potentially true. That is
Mm.
potentially true. But what I find interesting is, and I find myself talking to clients about a lot. I have very few clients that fit that model of a narcissist, that we
Yeah,
view kind of real arrogant, grandiose. They don't tend to come to therapy. They're not interested in my
that's true.
opinion.
Yeah,
They don't really want feedback. So
yeah,
they don't tend to book the session. So
yeah,
I maybe I've never had any, is the
hmm
truth of it.
yeah,
All of my clients at various points move into certain aspects or certain narcissistic traits.
yeah,
And what's interesting is this idea that narcissism is always that kind of arrogance. It
yeah.
actually can be victimhood. You know,
Yes, I've seen that as well. Absolutely.
a real focus on me, poor me, complete self-focus.
Yeah,
It's that it's kind of covert, it's victimhood. It's the opposite actually of that, of
yeah,
that image that we have of the narcissist.
yeah.
And it's not NPD. It is
hmm
absolutely categorically not NPD. But it is a narcissistic trait. It is
Yeah,
it can be considered that, really intense self-focus
yeah.
on our needs that then
hmm
prevents us from moving into empathy
hmm
around someone else's needs. And
Yeah,
we may alongside that move into blaming. So there are different kind of flavors of narcissism,
yeah.
I'd say.
And that's a good point. I think that the victimhood piece I've seen a lot with people who have this kind of duality. On the one hand, they seem to think that they know everything, but then they're always the victim and nothing is really ever their fault. And that can be really hard for the other person because I guess it's a form of manipulation, right? Usually somebody who has this mindset of being a victim and never, everything's happening to them. They usually get in relationships with people who are highly empathetic and who want to help them. And so it creates kind of that perfect cocktail or that very imperfect cocktail of somebody who's highly empathetic with somebody who's not at all.
Yeah, so problematic and so common,
Mm,
and I think, what I would sort of urge people to do is begin to use that concept of survival,
yeah,
recognizing that everything we're talking about is somehow linked to fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse.
yeah,
We go into divorce and we go into survival. There's no
yeah,
other way around it. Like
yeah,
everything feels threatened.
yeah. Because
I
it
do
is a
that.
major reset
It is.
on every front.
Absolutely,
Mm,
absolutely. And some people come out of that relatively quickly,
hmm
if they've had done a lot of kind of therapeutic work on themselves in the past, if they have a really solid support system,
hmm
if it's very amicable
hmm
with the divorcee, the other person that's going through it with the ex-husband, ex-wife. Um, but most people go into survival for a fairly long period of time. And
Yeah,
in survival, we are surviving. We are trying,
yeah,
we are doing our best. We are pushed to our edges. It is incredibly hard and intense. So, even the fight energy, if you think about what narcissism is, that real
hmm
like stamp of a feet and blaming and manipulation and control and finger pointing,
yeah,
the fight energy, they're in survival. They're,
yeah,
they're fighting. They are fighting
yeah.
because they feel deeply, deeply, deeply threatened.
They're like a cornered animal
That's
trying to
it.
fight for their life. Yeah,
Right, right. And it is painful and it is not at all even appropriate at times to
yeah,
try and engage with them. But remembering that as we go into divorce, we all go into survival and we adopt different patterning. A
hmm
very problematic one is if often more common in women would be when they go into fawn. They
hmm
try and people please. They
yeah,
they go into this and that kind of tracks with the victimhood piece.
Yeah, that's
You
true.
know, they go into
Yeah.
victimhood. They do what they can to kind of appease the situation. They make themselves small. They don't fight for what they need, what they
Hmm.
deserve.
Yeah.
Um, so, you know, becoming aware of what that means and what that looks like for each of us individually, in terms of where we go when we are pushed into survival, when we go
Yeah.
into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse, is
Yeah.
really important, because narcissism is just one piece of it.
It's a very primal reaction, effectively, because we are in that very triggered situation. So, I'm sure that just like me, you see a lot on social media, in the media in general, actually, a lot of talk about narcissism. And I, I guess I'm curious about what are some of the misrepresentations or misconceptions that you see people share, or try to inform other people about, that are wrong. So what are those misconceptions, effectively, with regards to narcissism?
I mean, I think one of them I've covered. I think the big one is this idea that it's only, you know, arrogant men, essentially.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we picture that grandiose, very arrogant, bullish male, and that's narcissism, or that's a
Yeah.
narcissist. And that's not true. There are
Yeah.
many iterations of that. Although I would also say that MPD does track with that. You know, you do
Okay.
see that a lot in that 1%, 2%.
Hmm.
Um, I think the use of the word narcissist,
Yeah.
I think, is a little bit problematic. You know, and maybe that's the
It's a
clinic
label.
for me. It's
Yeah.
a label, you know. They make me ugh, anyway. And
Hmm.
when is it appropriate to use it? When is it not? Because
Yeah.
you know, let's say 1% of the population have MPD, very,
Yeah.
very, very rare, essentially.
Hmm.
So then, when you know, you have people saying, "Oh, you know, my partner's a narcissist." If you think about the way that I've explained it and the spectrum, you think, well, what does that mean? You know,
At what stage do you get the label?
right,
Yeah.
exactly, because it's highly unlikely they've got NPD. They
Yeah.
might, in
Yeah.
which case they need some, you know, there needs to be an intervention there to help, because it's a
Yeah.
personality disorder. So
Hmm.
when do we use that term narcissist?
Yeah.
And maybe we don't, you
Yeah.
know, unless we're talking about people with NPD, then it's completely
Yeah.
appropriate. They are narcissists.
Yeah.
Other than that, they are movable aspects of the way humans interact and behave. They overlay with fight, flight, freeze, fall, and collapse. We move in and out of them.
Hmm.
So just like any labeling, you know,
Yeah. It doesn't
it
define you
yeah,
necessarily.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So
Um,
I guess
yeah.
that the burning question now is, from the standpoint of someone who's dealing, let's call him, with a very difficult ex, whether narcissistic or not, but somewhere on that spectrum. Are there any strategies that you can share with them to collaborate with somebody like that, or to, sometimes co-parent with them?
Oh, interestingly, internally, I can just feel like, no, not really. You know, I think it's very, very, very hard. You
Yeah.
know, if you picture that cornered animal snarling, I think that probably helps. Would
Yeah.
I ever suggest that people use different tools to try and approach them? I probably wouldn't. You
Hmm.
know, I think boundaries are essential. I think having a
Yeah.
great solicitor, great divorce coach, I think having therapeutic spaces to process what's going on.
Hmm.
Um, the women that I support who are going through very, very acrimonious divorces,
Hmm.
whose partners don't haven't been diagnosed with NPD, but you know, a lot of addiction coming up, a lot of narcissistic traits, a lot
Yeah.
of cruelty, manipulative behaviors, finger pointing and blame, and all the things that
Mm.
we talked about, complete lack of empathy.
Yeah.
Um, you know, that I think the thing that I'm doing in session all the time is trying to help them trust their perspective. Because what's
Yeah.
happening is this kind of mind-bending thing that's going on, where you've got this violence of kind of perspective and narrative.
Yeah.
You did this, it's your fault. So my job really is to kind of stand in the way of that and say, no, like, let's create some space.
Yeah.
So not interact with them. Let's just communicate through solicitors,
Yeah.
or whatever that might look like. But let's get as much space as we can.
Yeah.
And let's trust your perspective. Like, what's your experience? What's your reality? How are you feeling?
Yeah.
So in terms of tools, I think the only appropriate thing to say, if it's a high level of narcissism that people are
Yeah.
dealing with, boundaries, boundaries,
Stay
boundaries.
as far
Stay
away as you
away.
can,
Stay
and
away.
if you have to interact, put some
Stay
boundaries
away.
in place. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what I've said to clients and have seen sort of come kind of it will eventually happen as the divorce process goes on. There's usually a moment at which they stand down.
Yeah.
They're in survival, so they are fighting and they're
Hmm.
cruel and they're kicking, and it all comes out once things settle. If you can get through the divorce process, I can't say with certainty that they're going to come out of survival, but
Yeah.
it's feasible to
Yeah.
theoretically presume that once everything has settled, they are going to exhale, they are going to feel a little bit safer, and they are going to stop fighting.
Yeah, because the contextual element is gone that was
Precisely.
triggering that. Okay.
Precisely. So it's almost like we have to kind of I have to hold the client through it,
Hmm.
always, just boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. And with this hope of it won't always be like this.
Yeah.
We can get the other side of the fight, the thing that's triggering them. We're potentially going to be able to move into a softer form of communication. But until then, it has to be a hard no, because no
Yeah.
one's ever going to speak to you that way.
And I like your point around blocking out their voice in your head. You can see how you've been married, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And for all that time, your spouse has been telling you that you're wrong, that you're stupid, that they know better, that you don't know how to do X or Y. That voice does get into your head, and learning to actually remove yourself from that, that influence, it's a very hard exercise for a lot of people.
It's incredibly, incredibly hard, yeah, and it takes time.
It does. I
It
think that's
really
probably a
does.
good message, actually, that, accept that for those who are exiting those kind of relationships, uh, knowing that it's going to take some time to be completely free of the other person's influence.
Oh, and I would say a really long time, and to just get support wherever you can. Find a great therapist. Therapists aren't the only avenue for support. Whatever that looks like, but it does take time. You
Yeah.
know,
And unfortunately for a lot of people, when there's children involved, they can't afford to just never see the person again and just, block them out of their life. And so then that's where, again, having that ongoing support is going to make a really big difference.
I think so, because the objective fact is the relationship breakdown. Therefore,
Yeah.
there are relational issues.
Yeah.
So we do need to learn a new way of communicating, a new way. There almost needs to be a kind of willingness to accept, yeah,
Yeah.
there has been a breakdown here, that we cannot communicate. We
Yeah.
cannot healthily move through this together. So even if the ex isn't willing to do the work, there's so
Yeah.
much that can be done on our side, on their side,
Hmm.
on a client's side, to learn what healthy communication looks like. And
Yeah.
often, I'm sure, with Chloe, in your job as well, it's really really going into the kind of getting very granular in terms of what healthy
Yes. Yeah.
communication looks like. The backwards, forwards, how to phrase something, how to pull back and listen with a different energy,
Hmm.
how to take ownership of your feelings, how not to project, how to
Yeah.
contain, so there's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
And, and through that learning, we heal so much. Like, it really can be this springboard into um, self-development. And
Yeah.
I feel really like a cheesy, I don't live in LA, and it's one of the really cheesy thing to say, but it is true.
Yeah, and I like the message of hope as well, because I think for the person who is, I'm going to use the word victim, it's probably not the right word, but who is dealing with an ex who's exhibiting strong narcissistic traits, it can feel like whatever you do, it's just not gonna work. And knowing that actually there are two people in the dance, and even if the other person is wrong, there's things that you can do that are in your control to stop that dynamic, or at least break the cycle. I think that's a very empowering thought, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of what keeps us in survival through the divorce is that feeling of being out of control.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
it's
true.
this uniquely excruciating feeling, you know,
Hmm.
wanting to have the answers, sitting in this not knowing, not being able to control. It's really
Plan your future, all of that.
right,
Yeah,
right. And it involves money and homes and children. And, you know, in terms of things that are traumatic, it ticks all the boxes. I would
yeah, yeah,
expect people to be going into survival in quite a strong way.
yeah.
Um, but it is absolutely also true that out of that, if we can become cognizant of the things that we can control, if we can like really level up in terms of
Yeah.
support, there's a direct correlation between trauma symptoms and support. Like
Oh,
the simplest thing that people can do is
yes.
get a therapist, get a divorce coach, get a
Hmm.
great solicitor that they can have open communication with and feel as safe as you can do,
Yeah.
emotionally. I mean. I know I don't mean that as a slur on solicitors. What I mean is that they're having problematic, difficult, triggering conversations. So of course,
Agreed.
sit there completely relaxed,
Hmm.
finding
And
someone that's,
trusting the other person.
yeah, exactly. Maybe that's a better word. Finding someone that you can trust. Yeah. So yeah, find people, and that in and of itself will help. Yeah.
That's brilliant advice. I'm going to end the podcast on that note because I love it. So, yes, get the right people around you and don't try and do it on your own because it's really hard. So, I love that message. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Really, it's a pleasure. It's so interesting.
And if people want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
Probably through the website is the best bet. So it's sarawoodhouse.com.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.